It's good to see you. I
Good
like
to
your
see
lighting
you.
effect. That's very good.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering about the need, like, there's this interesting tension in philosophy where
Mhm.
philosophy has to talk about why philosophy sucks. Likewise, there's this tension, but you know what? You see it in all the fields. I mean, economists now have to talk about the problem with economic modeling. Academics have to talk about the problem with college. Sociologists have to talk about the problem with theories versus kind of lived. That's why they kind of went in more of an individual empowerment structure, precisely because it's like, oh, sociological theory isn't helping anyone. But it almost sometimes does seem as if philosophy is the most ashamed of itself in a way. And I wonder why. Is it because philosophy, and we do David Hume, and his whole thing is the idea that if philosophy becomes this kind of disconnected from common life, it causes philosophical melancholia, which is very problematic. But then also there's the idea that without philosophy, you don't have self-defense. And then another thing I wonder about is how do you stop doing philosophy and it not require thoughtlessness, right? Like there's kind of this idea that people are like, oh, philosophy is dangerous, but how do you not do philosophy? Because that it kind of requires the possibility of not doing philosophy in order to be like philosophy is kind of bad. But it always seems to me the moment you stop doing philosophy, you're in a dangerous place, right? Because now you've closed your mind. And how do you at some point stop? Like if you're a Christian, at what point do you stop thinking about what the Bible means or who Christ is? Like if you're an American, at what point do you stop asking what is freedom? What is justice? What should I vote for? What shouldn't I vote for? Right? Like there's this kind of weird question of when do you stop? How do you stop? Without it being too early or making you kind of susceptible to manipulation. And that was always David Hume's tension, because he talks about the difference between bad philosophy and good philosophy, which seems to be what everyone's getting at. Limburg, with that recent article, and a lot of people, I mean, we talk about it all the time, is there seems to be different kinds of philosophy in the same way there seems to be different kinds of economics, different kinds of sociology, different kinds of learning. And I wonder if maybe philosophy is, it seems to me, and maybe it's just my own bias or just looking at it, that philosophy is particularly prone to see itself as bad or dangerous or high, like kind of high and not really dealing with anything. And I wonder what it is about philosophy that makes it particularly prone to, what makes philosophy particularly prone to being so critical of itself. Maybe because it's so abstract, like it's kind of thinking about thought, where at least with sociology, it's like, well, it's about society. With economics, you can say, well, it's at least about economics. Maybe it's because the subject of philosophy is so unclear that it's more susceptible to feel like it's not about anything, that it feels like it's not about anything. But of course, people who do it are like, no, it's actually about everything. Whereas if you can claim you do economics, even if you're dealing with a theory that has nothing to do with the real world, like Nassim Taleb will critique, you can at least fall back on saying, well, I am at least studying real people doing real things called economics, where philosophy almost doesn't have a clear subject that it can fall back on. So it's easier to think it's not about anything. And then also maybe, well, and then maybe we're also influenced by capitalism in the sense of if we're all doing philosophy and we're not getting paid for it, why? Why are we doing it? Oh, we must just enjoy ourselves. We must just enjoy hearing ourselves, right? There's kind of that skepticism where at least you say, well, I'm paid to do economics. You can kind of go, oh, well, it's my job. So no one would accuse, even if people are like, it's dangerous, you may at least not be so susceptible to being accused of just doing something kind of high convoluted for yourself because you can tap it up to your job. So those are thoughts that are going through my head. I'm also very curious about this development with the Q thing with the AI. That's kind of interesting. Some people think it's conspiracy, other people, it's an entirely different subject. But I'm very interested in this question about philosophy critiquing itself and how to find the balance, because again, look, the whole conflict of mind, deconstructing common life, is about how philosophy leads to philosophical melancholia and therefore is very dangerous. But then, of course, the problem is after the sociological reality of losing Gibbons, without philosophy, you're going to fall into banality of evil, nihilism. You're going to be susceptible to totalitarianism. So there's this navigation that's necessary that seems like really, really, really difficult, very difficult to navigate what has to be navigated?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question that you're posing. And I mean, I think that I wonder if there's kind of a way in which there's a, I mean, I think that perhaps maybe what kind of was the, for lack of a better term, a type of whipping boy before philosophy was religion.
Sure.
And now that, you know, because we live in a bit more of a postmodern age where we kind of already like the cynicism toward religion is sort of like well ingrained or whatever, like there maybe it's looking to philosophy as, well, we thought maybe we could kind of think our way out of problems, or we could theorize our way out of problems, and if we still are dealing with really very difficult situations, or there's things in the world that we're really upset about, understandably so, but we almost look to, I wonder if it's almost like getting frustrated with philosophy for not like solving those problems. Like we know, and I don't know though, because in the general, there could also be a way in which it's healthy and good to have like a type of ability to critique oneself or to have self-skepticism. I think that's something good about philosophy, but also it can go in the extreme where we sort of just want to like just, I don't know, abandon it, you know, entirely. And it's like, well, like you said, I mean, how do you do that anyway? Like, I know that people can disagree, and I certainly wouldn't impose on other people, oh, well, you're doing philosophy, even though you don't realize it. But the thing is that we all think things, right? We all have certain narratives. We all have certain understandings of reality. And, you know, like Rand said, it's sort of secondhand smoke. If we don't sort of understand that ourselves, what is it that we think about? What is it that how do we operate in the world? And that is a type of philosophy, even if we don't want to, again, and I'm not saying we have to kind of adhere to that term, but it's just simply that we don't want to become thoughtless. But I think there's also a frustration when thoughtfulness seems to not really be doing what we hoped it would do, or something. I don't know if this is just a rational, progressive hope or something like that. But then I would say I'm not sure that's philosophy, but more of a kind of reliance on rational, you know, like the kind of autonomous rationality. But anyways, I guess that's what my thought is. It's almost like, okay, it was religion. That was kind of for lack of a better term, whipping boy. Then it became philosophy, because we kind of assumed the cynicism. We kind of assumed that, you know, well, yeah, of course, like, you know, religion is corrupt, right? On the whole, in the postmodern era. And so that it went to sort of, maybe it's like philosophy that became what is thought of as the potential, you know, scout, you know, it's kind of like they're the culprit, you know, like that's, but I think that it might just be the way that it's language today. I do think it's probably just a lack of making that distinction. Like we might want to be upset with philosophy, but we know we're still going to do it anyway, because we know we all do still think and have these ideas. And the very fact that you're upset about something, the hope is that other people would also see and feel the same, maybe not the same as you, but hopefully can resonate with that and be whatever it is, mobilized, or feel the same sense of indignation, whatever the thing is. It's like the reason why one is upset by that and upset with philosophy for not doing more about that, right? It's like that is a type of idea right there.
Right.
Okay, she has that button. Okay. So basically, I hope that makes sense. But what I mean to say is, like, I think that I think there is a frustration with it not being able to do more, but then almost being like, for lack of a better word, I do think it might be a type of cynicism where it's like, well, why did we ever think it would do anything anyways? It's just philosophy. It doesn't really do anything, really. You know, there's kind of this sort of like, well, like as soon as there's kind of a disappointment with it, we just sort of want to, you know, kind of almost like abandon the whole thing, because we've been like, I don't know, in a way it's almost like the veil's been torn and we don't see anything, you know, we see there's like kind of we realize that it was sort of nothing there, in the sense of there being kind of like no big other or something like that. But I don't know, I do think there's something about it where it's just being careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that's like with anything, like we can have all this frustration and ups, you know, all of these kind of emotions about what we want to see or what we're hoping for, what what we're upset about happening in the world or whatever it is. And I think that it's just a lot about understanding like what is, yeah, you want to use that too? Okay, you can have a turn with that too. So I think it's just kind of about realizing that sometimes we're upset and we don't know what to do with that frustration. We don't know what to do with that feeling. And it's easy to just kind of assume that like, okay, well, these things must be failing, like we're not doing this well enough or the right way. But instead of thinking about how to correct it, we just might want to leave it, like abandon that project entirely. So I don't know. I think those are some thoughts that come to mind, and I understand the frustration, right? But it's sort of like, for me, I always think it's maybe not a useful analogy for other people, but for me it is. Like I think about religion as the earth, the ground itself, and then philosophy as the sky, that like the air and the sky. And it's almost like this is just, there's no way to kind of avoid these things. So in some ways we might do ourselves worse off to just leave it because, or think of it as like it's what failed. I think what's failed is that we're fallen, that we're not like we're the reason why we see things that frustrate us means we care about something, and that's wonderful because you have a heart and you care. But it's like it also means that we are fallen, and I don't think that's like we can't really put on anything except that condition that we are currently in. I think it's not like, I mean, you can see particular things that maybe cause things to be the way that they are, but that's always because it's a bothness, right? Philosophy can be really good and really bad. Religion can be really good and really bad. And so, yeah, I think that's what comes to mind.
So that was very good. A bunch of things come to mind. It almost seems as if philosophy is now guilty for the problem of evil. If God is dead, then something has to be guilty for the problem of evil, and it's philosophy. Precisely because philosophy feels like philosophy can be about anything in the same way that it feels like God can do anything. And if there's bad things happening, then God's not doing his fair share, so he's to blame. Likewise, if philosophy is not stopping bad things, then it's philosophy's fault. It can be about anything, so if it's not doing something, it must be to blame. So it's almost like the problem of evil is now philosophy's fault, which is very interesting. I'm also interested, it's almost like, actually, more generally, though, there's a general kind of academic penance going on, where every field is almost apologizing. It's almost like a religious kind of Puritan movement. So economics is apologizing for 2008. Literature is apologizing for supporting white hegemony, white male hegemony. The humanities in general are. The sciences are apologizing for reductionism. And then everyone's mad at college because it promised a job and you can't get it. So it's almost like intellectualism in general is in this kind of phase of penance. And maybe that's actually good because for so long it's been so arrogant. There's been an arrogance that people are reacting against, where they're like, oh, the economists said they could do so much and they couldn't even stop 2008. Wealth inequality. What good is economics anyway, right? And then, again, like, well, why even have a literature major if, literature is the product of keeping people out of the discourse, like minorities and women. And there's this kind of sense that they're all sinners and they all need to, ask for forgiveness and get penance. So there's almost now these kind of penitence rituals, kind of trying to absolve you of this.
What's that word?
Penitence. What is it? Penance ritual. I can't even say it. Like penitence. What is it in religion? Penance. So like there are these rituals of penitence where, because it's also interesting, where now in a discourse, if you're an economist, to be taken seriously, you have to say somewhere in there about how economics is not just about stupid modeling, it should be about real people's lives. Like you have to say that. Like likewise, literature needs to be about responding to people's lived experience. Oh, Mr. Rivera. So there's this kind of idea that these things have to respond to real life. And if it doesn't, there's a major problem. And so there's this kind of question where there's this general sort of penitence about all of these fields in academia in general. And that's a good thing in the same way that in religion, there needs to be this kind of penance where you take penance on and forgive. But you have this thing now, Mr. Rivera, good to see you, sir, where penitence, I can't say, we're like, Economists have to apologize that economic modeling isn't about real life. Literature has to kind of apologize for being about pleasure. Sociologists have to apologize about having theories. Philosophy has to apologize for sort of abstraction, and all of that is very good. But it's very interesting where, like we were talking about the other day, there's kind of this repetition of the history of religion in different fields, right? So you had this kind of growing of Christianity but then it became Constantine. It was very successful. Likewise, intellectual life got into colleges. And then after World War II, everyone had to go to college to get a good job. And then it led to the Dark Ages, or it fell into decline. And you have this period of penance. And it's almost like what you see in intellectualism now is a phase of penitence, which is good because the hope is that in the same way that Protestantism or Christianity, there's a lot of like, okay, well, how do we move out of Gnosticism back to a kind of religion that's on the ground, that heaven, New Jerusalem emphasize co-creation versus salvation. That's all been a positive development in the history of religion. And it's almost like, I wonder now if it's this phase where the economists are going, we've been about modeling for too long. We have to like actually be about starting businesses in people's lives. And so like every single field, if the college monopoly was the Holy Roman Empire almost, or Constantine or something, and I know those are generalities and whatever, and you had this kind of power structure that's failed. And now it's actually all of intellectual life and all these different fields are having to go through a penance. I wonder if like it's almost this movement then to the concrete. So the difference between good economics and bad economics, good sociology and bad sociology, good philosophy, bad philosophy, good thinking and bad thinking. It's all very interesting. And it's just interesting, like you say, it's almost like too, there's this need that now, if God is dead, someone's got to be responsible for the problem of evil. And it's like, well, it's thinking, it's philosophy, it's economists, these are now responsible for evil, and especially philosophy, because philosophy can be about everything, right? Philosophy can be about everything, and so anything bad that occurs, it could have stopped and it didn't, and so there's a kind of like problem of evil that emerges. But then again, there is this kind of endless spurious infinity of philosophy always having a new model, a new word, a new idea that has to be watched again. In economics, there's always a new explanation of the 2008 crisis. There's always a new model that's going to stimulate the economy. And all of these kind of spurious things we have to guard against. But then it's like, so you've got this tension where all intellectual life, because you can do it in religion too, right? You can have an endless spurious of theological concepts. There's this thing of how do you guard against the spurious, bad, disembodying forms of intellectual life, philosophy, literature, while at the same time you have this problem of how do you even stop, like if you're a Christian, how do you stop thinking about Christianity, where you're like, well, I don't want to just kind of be caught up in convoluted theology, but what would that mean? Don't you have to risk thoughtlessness? Like, how do you balance? There's a really fine skill here today that I'm wondering, I guess this is my point, and then I'll give it to Javier Rivera. There's a really fine skill here that seems really important that maybe, honestly, in the history of humanity has not been thought so well, because most of intellectualism has been contained in universities, or it's been contained in the classroom, where now we're on Zoom, we're working blue collar while also reading Hegel, while also feeling confronted by the failures of the church, while also like interacting with people dealing with intellectual life. And there's this kind of sense of, well, I know the kind of jerk that a lot of those college professors were, who never actually in their life worked a real job. I don't want to do that. But at the same time, I know all these people who don't think about stuff, who were controlled and captured and don't know how to navigate relationships. This to me is a very difficult tension that you see more and more people on the liminal web kind of, Lindbergh had that piece, Javier's talked about it, we've talked about David Hume, this tension of figuring out the limits of thinking life that are not escapism, while at the same time acknowledging the dangers of unthinking life. There's some taste here, and I'm just thinking about kind of church history, and if like after the Holy Roman Empire, and you could even say after like fall, the moral majority in American Christianity in the 70s, all of those failed, and people were like, wow, we were a bunch of Gnostic people, not concerned about life and instead salvation. How do we rethink that? If you actually have a similar history with the rise and fall of the college system, where like it rose, it was powerful, and then fell, and people were like, well, we don't want to do that again. But But how do we do that in a good way? I've been seeing parallels and thinking about, but Javier Rivera, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you have been doing well.
I think right now, I think we're like a kind of like in an age of like really hardcore cynicism, um, which perhaps feeds into the contemporary logic of like everything's relative, right? Even though that understanding is a kind of like horrible um understanding of postmodern thought, actually. like like it's not like it's weird because it's like we're in this age now where we've accepted postmodern thought, but then also not really, because postmodern thought did not come with just echoing its conclusions, but actually came with a kind of methodology to deal with its conclusion, right? That's the whole thing, right? Like, it's not just that Derrida, Deleuze, and all these sort of postmodern thinkers agreed on a relative conclusion, but it's the fact that they all came up with their own methodology to deal with that conclusion. And what I see is, we're talking about like our current times, what I see is that we have been completely disconnected from the conclusion and its methodology for dealing with that conclusion. Now, again, we can all, we can attack postmodernism, but like, I feel like if we attack postmodernism, we're just attacking, in general, probably the academic pursuit, which some people have done. But then also some of us have just completely attacked what people just echo as its conclusion, which is not really a adequate critique, because what we see here is that people don't understand that it came with a methodology. So it's not about like, so basically that critique is fruitless, because without understanding the methodology, then it dissipates the critique, right? Like, there's no point in critiquing postmodernism if people don't understand the very implicit methodology that was kind of proposed to use and navigate the world. And I just don't really see that in I don't really see that. So I guess I'm even hesitant to even say, like, in a sort of general view, that we're actually in a postmodern age. We're like more of like a parody of a postmodern age. So like it would seem like ridiculous to even say like, oh, we need to be like meta modern, which I know some people have tried to come up with, but like, I don't see that, because I feel like people's general understanding of things, especially in like the coming generations, or like the generations that are like 20, 18 years old, they understand that everything's relative and that there is no fundamental, final, absolute truth, but what they're missing is the methodology to that. They don't understand that whole process. The whole process has been completely bypassed. So I feel like there's a couple of problems that we have to talk about, because there's a complete disjunction in history right now, in my opinion, where postmodernism isn't really the postmodernism that we're talking about, or at least a lot of the postmodern stuff that it is. And it may even look and appear that way, because a lot of us, you and I are kind of in the circles that really do understand some of postmodern thought and its methodologies. And so, again, it's worth having conversation and critiquing that. But then in the general vicinity of just people living their lives and not really engaging with philosophy in the way that we engage with it, it really does kind of like, is it really postmodernism, as the ruling force, or is it somehow its conclusion that seems to be its ruling force, that is perhaps more detrimental to us than the risky methodologies that these thinkers propose to us, which it might conclude to why we need Hegel more than ever, because how is one to connect us to the disjunction or the opposition between conclusion and methodology for what people don't have? So it's possible, but yeah, I'll leave it there.
I really like what you were saying. I think it is very astute to suggest that we have kind of absorbed or defined postmodernism by merely its understanding of the culture or its prescription, but not its solutions or addresses. Because, for example, a lot of people talk about on grammatology, but not the gift of death of Derrida, right? Like Derrida goes and writes all these works afterwards. Likewise, people talk about difference and repetition with Deleuze. You know, Deleuze has this whole idea of kind of the epistemological method of overlap of kind of the essential effort. Like you say, okay, well, if they can't connect because of essential difference, you could still have overlap and have a valid epistemology. So he, I don't, it would require the perennial Hegel Deleuze debate, but Deleuze is aware of, if he's going to throw out epistemologies of analogy or of epistemologies of representation, that means a lot. But all of them, it's similar. Because as you're saying, I sometimes wonder if we actually completed postmodernism in the sense that we read it. I wonder that sometimes with like modernism as well, actually. Like, did we actually think it through completely? And it's kind of funny because in the same way that religion, like there's always this, it's like, oh, in Christianity, we're yet to do real Christianity. It's almost like, I wonder if history is always a yet to do modernism, yet to do postmodernism, yet to do romanticism. And there's this kind of joke that defines history where we never do the thing that we're then moving beyond. Where like, we never actually do it. And to me, I think I've mentioned it to you before. One of the, my dear beloved Vincent Zimmern once said to me that it's okay to be Aristotle, probably not okay to be an Aristotelian. It's okay to be Heidegger, probably not a Heideggerian. And what he was getting at is basically every day of the week in every single freaking field, the original thinker usually is more aware of the entire project than the movements after. And how many people on planet Earth do we think has literally read every book by Derrida? That's kind of the joke. Like, how many people have read every book by Deleuze? Probably not many. And yet we proceed to talk about Deleuze. We proceed to talk about Heidegger. To me, a lot of, perhaps, I'm not sure, but I sometimes think that the methodologies of postmodernity, which, as you know, are very much about opening for the other. I mean, there's a lot of I-thou that's trying to get through on postmodernity. It's speaking to the Heideggerian notion of clearing, which nobody gets to because everyone's stuck on Heidegger being. And so that's another example where Heidegger writes Being and Time, very famous book, and then he writes a bunch of smaller books. And then at the end of his life, he writes a bunch of smaller books like Pathways and Clearing. He's really like, and he gets to the point where he's like, I don't even know if I should have talked about being. Maybe I should have just talked about clearing. You're like, what? Huh? You go through college though, and you read Heidegger, you read Being and Time. But we did. It's like, oh, you're a Christian. You've never read the Bible, but you know the Apostle Creed. And it's almost like all of human existence is like pseudo histories. I don't want to say fake, misread. Like Harold Bloom's all misreading. Like we're always just misreading Christianity or incomplete of Heidegger. But then at the same time, so it's almost like what ends up happening. Like in trying to avoid, and then I'll give it back to you, Javier, this kind of relativism of postmodernity, we're now in a kind of like spurious reaction. Like it's like we've responded to the fear of relativism with a spuriousness of just adding new philosophical ideas to try to like respond to it. And there's a kind of continuation. And that's what happened for David Hume, is like once you lose the embeddedness of philosophy in the lived experience, which, I, thou, clearing or whatever, it has a spurious character that leads to philosophical melancholia. And it's almost like, if you look at the postmodernity, relativism, as you know, the term I like to use, becomes more of a conditionalism. What are the conditions you have to meet to actually be there for the other person? But then there's this tension too, because it's like, we have this tendency not to complete a thinker or a project. But then at the flip side, it's almost like we then have a reaction against that to become like totalitarian readers. It's like, oh, you have to be a Hegel scholar and read everything really close, so you don't do that. And then there's a form of oppression that happens there. And then, of course, you could have a million readings of Hegel and then it's just an endless game and it doesn't go anywhere. So there's this ditch on the side of defining a movement in a straw man kind of way, dare I say. But then there's the totalitarian reading that then leads to the problematic scholarship structure that doesn't seem to be correct. And there's some middle ground there that has to be navigated that I think about a lot. And it seems like and this question seems relevant not just for philosophy, but economics, politics, religion, like this ground between trying to like give the fullness of the account to the thinker, but not ending up a totalitarian reader, right? That seems to be really tough to figure out. Those are just thoughts that come to mind, but let me give it back to you, Javier Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, what's crazy here about like, did we ever like fully complete modernity? Did we ever fully complete postmodernism? Like, these are these are great questions to ask, because I think the danger of like this spuriousness that you're talking about is perhaps exactly believing that we did complete it, right? It's that belief that we did complete it. So then it's like we have these academic and then layman contradictions. It's like the academic is assuming that it's been completed, and then the academic is trying to go beyond its completion, which also poses a problem because it's not actually completed. And then you know, we live in this progressive society where it's ironically not progressive, because the very conditions that was supposed to make post-modernity progressive was actually its very methodology itself, right? And that is what's always getting put into the question, because it really becomes like a pseudo. It basically, what I see now is kind of like relativism, the way people talk about it, like, oh, well, it's kind of like all relative anyways. It's more like a sort of subtle passive aggressive way to say that I still have an absolute truth, but it's now more protected because it's found in its particularity, right? It's protected by my own particularity. So therefore I passively aggressively protect my absoluteness by expressing my particularity. And that to me is really no different in terms of the outcome when we talk about totalitarianism, like, right? Because then now it just becomes a question of like, it's just a matter of when, like, it's not a matter of like who's the bad guy. It's a matter of when the good guy is going to become the bad guy, right? Which is sort of very symbolic of like the Batman movie, where it's like after you've been doing this for a while, he's afraid to become the very thing that he's been trying to defeat, right? So it really does pose a problem. So I feel like I think some of the solution or some of the navigation that is needed is like, I mean, it's so hard because I think like academically, I think good academics realize that the work is never finished. So it would be hard to even really make the confident move of like, let's go past post-modernity. Like, ironically, it would be the Hegelian move, right? Going past post-modernity would actually be going backwards. Really, like it would be going backwards and then transforming our understanding, which would be, you know, the sublimation thing, the preserving and elevating kind of dynamic that is found in dialectics. But yeah, I think as like maybe like a layman philosopher myself, I think the task for me that I found is helpful in relation to others is sort of just like maybe underpinning or revealing, uncovering the fact that whatever is supposedly finished is not finished. And I'm not really sure if there's any specific methodology to portray that for each person, but I think the fundamental outcome or strategy should be to do that, to kind of like, you know, because these people are not going to read Hegel. These people are not going to read Heidegger. They're not going to read Derrida to the end. They're not going to read Plato all the way to its end. If we accept that, but if we also accept that it's part of our responsibility that because we're already interested in this pursuit, that we probably will finish, you know, reading Derrida's Gift of Death and other avenues of thought, then we can relay this back into our sort of personal relationships and community, that these thoughts never fully finished in themselves. There's still much to have conversation about. There's still much to explore within a certain thought. It's like the same problem with like Hegel and like not Derrida, Deleuze, right? Like if you're contrasting two positions, right? Like it becomes a parody of itself, because it's like, well, how much have we actually explored to the depth of Deleuze and to the depth of Hegel, right? Like, so it really almost becomes like this sort of parody of like, oh, I'm a Deleuzian going to take down Hegel, but that Hegel is just like a sort of really lame caricature of what is being taken down, and vice versa, right? So we have to understand, and probably in the most Hegelian fashion, which is also ironically anti-Hegelian, that it's not finished. Like, it's not finished. Even the debate itself would not be finished. But I guess in terms of the demands of like our time, with what urgency should we draw the line and be like, this is what we should answer with, right? Which is, of course, coming down to a fundamental choice and risk of like, I think as of right now, because even though I could spend the rest of my life exploring the Deleuze and Hegel debate, I still have to make a decision within the necessity of time, given our historical political context, right? So it's like, there's another impasse that we can't escape, as as thinkers, or even as layman thinkers, to maybe push the world in a different direction.
I think that was very well put. So a few things come to mind. Like, something that we learned from postmodernity is the necessity of otherness, space for other, making yourself an other to yourself, being skeptical of clear definitions or categories or different things, because they tend to have a certain exclusion. And to me, that was always very influential, in the sense that if I'm going to do economics, then I need to make economics an other to itself by referring to sociology or philosophy or lived personal experiences of the blacksmith. And I wonder if part of the problems tend to occur when you do a field in a field to the field self, because that almost requires then an enemy. So, for example, if you say, well, I'm a philosopher and I do philosophy and I want to find the true philosopher, and I got to stop postmodernity, it's almost like you need something to stop then from within philosophy. But if instead you go, well, I do economics, and economics seems to be self-congratulatory because everyone are making their models to get the Nobel Prize or whatever. So what I'm going to do is actually ask, does capitalism, so capitalism says the market is always rational. And this was actually a big thing for me. It's like, but what if rationality is not what we think it is? Oh, crap. And so for me, like, because in starting a lot with literature and economics and things like that, there was the question of, well, wait a minute, if rationality is not what the market thinks it is, and what if people aren't self-interested in the way that capitalism assumes, well, then everything economics does is going to be on a very problematic paradigm, an axiom. And so then you're like, well, what is rationality? And so for me, like, reading a Hegel or reading a Hume was always for a concrete problem located outside of philosophy. And that kind of changes, like, looking for the bad guy or looking for the enemy, because you also go in, and I guess just after reading Harold Bloom, basically knowing you're going to misread, and knowing that Derrida is smarter than you. He's smarter than you, okay? You're just going to have to accept that. Deleuze is smarter than you, okay? You go in with just assume they already thought about that and assume they're smarter than you. And when you do that, you are not going in looking for an enemy, because your investigation is for a concrete problem outside of philosophy. That for me is big in economics. And actually, I think basically the economic issues are the most pressing ones for, like, sustainability, for the liminal web, for in general, like, economics. If there's one field that philosophers tend to try to avoid at all costs, it tends to be economics, because it is such a slap in the face. But that's precisely why you kind of need to lean into it. And and the other concrete problem was the issue of like, basically people starting organizations or communities, and then due to hurt or misunderstanding or self-deception, the organizations failed. And the question was, how can we think through that occurs, and how can you better communicate that to people that they don't feel like they're being lectured to, right? Because nobody feels like saying, hey, you're self-deceived. Well, screw you, buddy. Like, how do you go about the art of communication and aware of dynamics? So there's a concrete problem outside of philosophy that you're going into philosophy to try to find resources for. And I'll give it back to you. The way I think about it, it's almost like the Minotaur's labyrinth, where like, oh, you're going into the labyrinth, you better keep on to that golden thread. It's almost like you always need a golden thread outside of a field to go into the field. Otherwise, it tends to become spurious, or tends to make scapegoats, or tends to make straw men. Like, you have to have something you're holding on to, where every field to itself can become a kind of labyrinth that then becomes very problematic. And you have to have this thread that you're holding on to that then keeps you in relation to otherness, because the thread speaks to something other than the labyrinth. It speaks to a world beyond it that then can help it remain, dare I say, dialectical. It can help it from becoming a complete system. Because here's the problem. Once philosophy becomes a complete system, the only way to give yourself an imperative almost is to find a problem in philosophy. And so then you misread postmodernity. Then you start saying, well, we got to move beyond modernity, because you're looking for something within it to justify the work, as opposed to something outside of it that you're trying to concretely speak to. So those are some thoughts I have. I'll give it back to you, because like, it's like that idea of postmodernity's, like that emphasis on the notion that the moment you lose otherness, there is a pathological structure that tends to emerge. Like, you take that seriously, then you always have to make sure in whatever field that you're in, that you have some sort of golden thread that you're holding on to as you go through the labyrinth. I mean, those are thoughts. I'd pass it on to you, Mr. Javier Rivera. I love your background, by the way. You're in a cool place.
Thank you. Thank you. I decided to sit outside today. Yeah, so said some good things here. I think, yes. So there seems to be this fiction that we have to do that becomes necessary. What is that fiction? That fiction is, how do we give the story that we're going beyond and yet ironically returning to exactly where we began? How do we give that narrative? Because it's funny, because as I've been reading this book that my friend Tyson recommended to me, called The Accessible Hegel, which is absolutely very accessible, I'd say. Very accessible. Definitely layman's style, and definitely would encourage you to actually read Hegel's works. But which is, I think, it's always good. That's the purpose of secondary literature or secondary sources, in my opinion. But anyways, one of my favorite stories is called The Alchemist, right? And even though it's ripped on for being very cliche, the fundamental story for me in this piece of literature is the fact that the boy tries to find the alchemist stone. And so he's going through a journey, never finds it, gives it up. All of a sudden, he finds it exactly where he began, where exactly from where he started. And yet he needed to go through this whole journey of being like, let me go act like I'm actually going to go beyond this. And then only to find out that it's always been there exactly from where he began. And so it does seem, and I think, you know, one of the difficult things, because I know I struggled with this too, was like, how do you override the sort of cynicalism that is seemingly inherent, or a sort of betrays itself in the person that is relaying the message of like, maybe we should rethink this, maybe we should question this, because no doubt the power semblance that's going to happen there is that the person is going to look at you like, okay, this guy is just trying to be smarter than me, right? Which already makes the engagement fruitless. Now, I haven't quite gotten around to this impasse, because it's like really hard to convince someone of like, hey, I'm not saying that I'm smarter than you, even though it really does look that way. But I noticed that in some of my conversations, like with my girlfriend, for example, she's very cynical, but that has been remedied by the fact of like kind of acknowledging that there is no fruitful end to cynicalism. Being cynical, there's just no fruitful end. So even if we entertain the worst scenario, that this person is being egotistical, full of grandeur and everything else, it gets us nowhere, really, right? So it's a fundamental, guaranteed, null outcome. Now we can approach it the other way around, where we say this person could be arrogant and egotistical. That could be true. However, let us risk the possibility of them being able to reveal something anyways. What if we pay attention long enough to understand that maybe they're not actually egotistical and arrogant, but it must kind of follow through that necessary fiction to, like, we have to risk that necessary fiction. I think maybe I don't know. I'll leave it there.
No, I think that's a testament to the methodology of postmodernity we left, because it requires the radical encounter, the radical relationship to know if this person is an arrogant person who thinks they're better than you or not. Like there's a certain radical encounter that is needed. Now, to people's defense, I do think the internet has changed a lot. And, this comes from my bias on the media thinkers, obviously your Virilios, your McLuhan, Postman, blah, blah, blah. For most of human history, like up until, I don't know, 10 years ago, the only people studying philosophy regularly probably were located in an academia, probably were individuals who just left home. And, whenever a kid leaves home, there is a kind of young man sort of, I'm free. And now I'm going to kind of figure everything out. And they're taking philosophy and they now think they understand the world better than their parents. And that has indeed defined a very large amount of philosophy, especially from, dare I say, the end of World War II until 2010, where the college system really took off. And so the high majority of people's experience with philosophers for most of history has been academic or university related. And really, if they study philosophy a lot, that means they almost by definition have to be a what? A graduate student or a professor, which tends to just simply from the nature of things lead to a certain attitude that can come off as arrogant or come off as superior. And look, you can look at Paul Johnson, Thomas Sowell, all these people about the intellectual class that have basically thought, because I have a PhD in economics, I know how to run your relationship, this kind of overreaching that people do, where they say, I have high IQ, therefore I know a lot. And so and then it's almost like America kind of a lot of nations were willing to kind of stomach that as long as college promised a job or kind of gave you something or had a certain social function. And now people are cynical of that because they've been hurt by that with college debt for a lot of people. And they have this history of the philosopher being insulated, very kind of insulated in their attitude. So it's understandable where that impression comes from. It's a kind of trauma. It's a kind of pain, and it's understandable. The difference now is with the internet, you have the possibility, and you're seeing more and more of this, still not many people, but certainly hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of individuals who work at Kmart, they have regular lives, but they've also been convinced there's something important with philosophy, and they're forming relations with people who agree. This is rather new. Maybe you could even go, and I really think it might be very new, because even if you go back to ancient Greek, they're probably all upper class, right? Like most of the people who would have done philosophy even before the university system were probably not working class. Like the working class, more middle class philosophical person, obviously there have been people like that in history. But as a growing community that are in touch with one another, that's probably pretty new. That's a sociological question. I'm now thinking about Randall Collins and all those different people, or James Hunter, or so on and so forth. But the internet has kind of introduced this new kind of regular engagement with philosophy that the majority of the human race has not gotten the memo, and reasonably so. Like, the people who have that memo should not expect otherwise, simply because, and it's not an arrogant thing, it's just an information thing. It's just a history sort of paradigm thing that's in operation. And in one way, it kind of gives me hope in some ways, because most of intellectual life, like, there's this concern right now with the liminal web, quote unquote, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, with this kind of idea of, oh, this is so disembodied. Right? Like, oh, we're online, we're not hit bodily, and you lose something. We just did this class on Ivan Illich. Ivan Illich would hate this. He'd be like, look, you can't like see the sweat of their brow. This is a real problem. And that's true. But at the same time, for most of human history, the cost of embodiment to do regular kind of intellectual engagement was to live in a bubble. You had to live on the college campus. The cost of embodiment with intellectual life was a bubble, and it still is mostly a bubble, because you have to get paid, and that means you're on a college. Now it's actually, although this comes with the cost of disembodiment, it does come with the benefit of people possibly being able to do intellectual work who are not in a bubble. And that gives me hope. And people who aren't in a bubble too might be in a better position to find this delicate balance between misreading, missing, concrete, abstract, because we don't have to keep tenure. We don't have to write a paper for a journal that's going to err on the side of the institution. So I wonder if it's kind of this historic moment with this new technology allows a different paradigm of doing things. Now, of course, I'm not saying it's perfect or anything. There are always trade-offs. But I wonder if there are some advantages there, because even just like you would get a chair or it would be kind of dangerous almost if your job was to critique postmodernity, to say that we haven't finished postmodernity, right? That could you could lose all your friends and lose all your class. But online, we can say it all day. We can be like, yeah, we can do it all day long. They can't do anything to us. So there's something about that. So I think about it. I'd be curious how you respond, Javier, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to like the economic barrier, right? If your job is to, then obviously critiquing the idea of, I mean, it's a risky endeavor for sure. If you were to openly state in academic field, like, hey, actually, we never just completed it. So all your work has been in some sense, for nothing. Yeah, people would probably have a problem with that, and you probably would risk losing your job and like risk, just being thrown out of academia, and you would just be like a rogue intellectual that's not connected to any academic, which I know some people do, and that's a kind of like heroic maneuver for them, and I totally support them for that idea. But yeah, you're right. The internet and the sort of these mediums that we're on sort of allow us to, ironic in some sense, it does free us from like economic constraints a little bit, right? Like the economic constraint is it demands very little, right? Like you just need enough money to have the internet, right? So it's not like a super imposing demand. Like I would say probably most people right now have it. Even in like, some people may have like periods of time where they have like blackouts, and they just notoriously know that these are moments in time there's just no internet, which is fine. But in terms of like the economic constraints, it seems like for the most part people can afford a internet relation to something, right? Economic constraints like buying books. Now of course people have construct, hopefully the problem of like the internet creating more economic constraints by saying like you need this much money to pay, join my book club or discussion like that may be problematic, but for the most part we always have the possibility or the avenue of making it free, for the most part, right? As long as you have the internet. So I think there's an argument to be said, like, yeah, there can be certain privileged moments within the internet, but then also very free and just egalitarian kind of like access. So I definitely see, and then this concept of like disembodiedness, I think if anything, what the internet does to us and for us is it proposes a rethinking of what we mean by concrete and disembodiedness, right? Like, I don't necessarily take all these new discoveries as direct challenges, other than more like direct questions of like, do we actually know what it means to be human, right? Like, it's, to me, it's exactly found in this question of the AI. Like, because people keep talking about like, oh, can the AI become human? Everyone's like arguing over this kind of arbitrary consensus of what it means to be human. But and so it gets obfuscated by the AI question, can AI become human? Rather, it should be a refocusing again of like, well, what do we actually mean by human? What is it that necessarily makes us so special? And is it possible that actually we're just not special? Have we also entertained that idea? And those are all questions worth asking and thinking through, because both of those questions would demand a complete reorientation about what we mean by being human, to help us even attempt to give this answer of, can an AI really surpass human, become more human? All these other questions that we're sort of haunted by. And so the same thing with embodied and disembodied, it just demands a sort of rethinking rather than a straight up denial, moral doom kind of logic. I think before we resort to a kind of moral doom or doom in general, we would have to, I think the real doom is not raising the question, right? Like, is this really happening? Like, is this really a doom scenario? Which is probably the most dooming kind of thing to explore, would be like, is it actually what it is, or is it not? So I do think there is really good points on the liminal website, and then the more our grappling experiences with each other. But yeah, leave it there.
I think it's excellent. I think it's very good I think there is a problem with this kind of embodied, disembodied dichotomy, if you will, because, and I think you put it very well, because I would argue that most people, most of the day, are not even embodied when they're off the internet. They're not even really there. They're just going through the motions. Do they really feel their breath? Are they really there? Like, because it's kind of a question, like, talking here, like about these things with stakes or that matter, or that you're really thinking and you're really engaged, it honestly feels like I'm more here than I am in many of the other places that I go through that are. So it's interesting, because it's like, it's almost, instead of embodied or disembodied, we need to talk about here or not here. Like, are you here? Like, presence or not presence? And that's closer, but most people associate present with embodiment. There's a ditch on either side of the road, but there is a kind of problem to just basically start doing this thing now where embodiment is good, disembodiment is bad. Because dis already in the language has a kind of value structure to it, right? It's like, oh, you're disembodied because we don't want to be heads on a stick. That's true. But we also shouldn't assume that all activities on the internet are equal, that they all have a kind of dopamine distraction structure to it. There are differences here that you're getting at that are very important. And the other thing too is, I guess, like, the point I think you're exactly right, that Zoom and all that, it's like, philosophy is cheap. You almost want to say that we went through a period in history where philosophy didn't make you money, but you were rich, so it didn't matter. Then you went through a phase where philosophy was expensive, because you basically had to go to college to have regular philosophy communities. You really did. Like, how are you going to meet someone in Lynchburg that reads Hegel, and what are the chances, right? It just wasn't. It was a logistical problem. And so you had where philosophy was like no money because it was aristocracy and it was, you know, in the polis or whatever with like the Greeks or whatever. Then you have philosophy that's expensive. And it's almost like for the first time in history, it's like cheap, like philosophy is cheap. So like no money, expensive, cheap. And and you could even say intellectualism in general. And the interesting thing that we have to ask is if we learn from postmodernity that the structure, the medium, the sociological condition always affects the kind of thought that comes out of it, what kind of thought is going to come out of a cheap philosophy that never came out of an expensive philosophy and that never came out of free philosophy, if you will? So maybe we'll put it that you had free, expensive, and now cheap. Like what kind of philosophy is going to come out of a world where philosophy is cheap? And I think that's a new kind of thought, really. I think it's going to be different because it's a different sociological condition. And I think, and yeah, a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, how is the liminal web economically sustainable? There's a lot of those questions, are very real questions. But there's also the benefit of the liminal web not being economically reliant on anything. That creates a certain freedom. So the question is, how do you have that freedom as sustainable without falling back into some sort of expensive structure or something? So I liked everything you said. Let me give it back to you. Because the embodied, disembodied, I really appreciate what you were saying on that. And some Gnostic people argue that like we shouldn't think of like body matter as just like body, that we need to think about energies and waves, and this has a different function, like the Hermetica tradition and all that. That's a big bag. I shouldn't have even brought that up because we're just asking to get pulled down into the void, or the bright void, if you will. But yeah, disembodied, embodied, here versus not, cheap philosophy. Anyway, Javier Rivera, please.
Well, I mean, we can even think of this dialectically, right? Like, how do we utilize disembodiedness to feed back a more embodiedness, right? Which would kind of override the moral panic that is sometimes found in AI and people's, you know, scare over algorithms and everything else. It's like, well, it's not that we should just get rid of it. Because, well, first of all, I just think that's impossible. Like, you can't, the ball is already rolling, baby. Like, it ain't gonna stop. The real question is, how do we not stop it, but how do we steer it in a direction that may be more fruitful, which is perhaps a better question, right? And yeah, I think there is a way to utilize disembodiedness. We can, you know, as a way to bring back a more concrete embeddedness, right? And vice versa. Because I think that the question is, and like it's, again, I'm basically repeating my point. It's like, how do we know that we are embodied if we don't first explore the disembodied sphere, right? Because then we are left with, are we really embodied if we're always refraining from risking the possibility of disembodied? Like, how would we actually know if we're disembodied if we don't explore the supposed risk of disembodiedness, which is all this online sphere, all this online thinking, all this online cheap philosophy that is surfacing now. And I think it's amazing in terms of the fact that I don't have to pay for a philosophical education in a sort of like formal fashion, like going through college. I don't have to. I can just, in some sense, read what I want, but then also reach out to people who have also read similar things and maybe even ironically have pursued a more formal education structure, right? Like talking to Cadell and like other people that actually have, like these very formal structures, which always adds a very interesting observation, but they also get an interesting observation in return, right? They also get fed something new in contrast to where they were limited by the structure of the formal setting of educational institution, whereas I'm perhaps more free, but also lack the formal structure. So I think instead of, I think it's probably a bad idea to villainize one or the other, but just see how they communicate to each other, which is something worth exploring. And how can we communicate with them in a sense that we still aim for a more concrete world, a more embodied world, which I feel like necessitates the disembodied sphere. Like, I feel like the only way to allow that movement to happen is the very existence of this disembodied sphere, you know? If not, then we are lost. This concreteness is not as concrete as we think it is, which would pose an even more danger to than simply refraining from or having this doom logic about disembodied online spheres and so on.
Yeah, because when I do this, I feel like I'm teleporting. I'm not disembodied. I'm teleporting into like Javier's porch outside area. Like, it's kind of funny because in a way it is kind of teleportation. Like, you're not literally leaving your body, right? Like, when I'm on the screen, I'm still here. I'm still in my body. Like, I'm not literally disembodied. So what we mean, it seems, is the notion of you are not focused on the concrete. Not that you're literally not embodied, but that you're not focused on embodiment. Well, hold on, that doesn't necessarily follow. This might be exactly the kind of conversation I need to be more embodied, because otherwise I was overwhelmed by confusion, anxiety, and not knowing how to like navigate life. Now, I feel like I have a better sense of how to navigate life, so I could actually be more embodied because I'm not overwhelmed by uncertainty and anxiety, right? So I think the language of embodied and disembodied is not even really an accurate description of what's going on. And in fact, it could make you, and in fact, most people in a sense are not present because they're overwhelmed by confusion, anxiety, emotional turmoil, and whatever. And everyone, like, no one would accuse a therapist, like if you were like talking with a counselor or a therapist or whatever to deal with your problems, are we going to call you? We're not going to say you're being disembodied. We're going to understand you're trying to walk through things to be more so not disembodied, right? But of course, the philosopher, like another reason you do conversations like this, I think, as a philosopher, or someone who does philosophy, is because you realize that a lot of the avenues societies offer to help you be more present in your life don't work, or there are limitations to them. And so, but the whole point is like basically some sort of navigation of embodiment of some kind. So there's a problematic languaging that doesn't really describe what's going on, nor does it necessarily describe what people are doing. What I think is going on is it's the idea that people who do, like, you go, okay, people on colleges are in a bubble. They're cut off from the real world. Maybe philosophers in colleges are in a bubble. Oh, if you're on a Zoom, you got to be a bubble too. And the new language for talking about bubbles is disembodiment. You're disembodied. You're not in a concrete life. Therefore, you're in a kind of bubble. But actually, that doesn't necessarily follow. But it's kind of what your associational logic is leading you to. Now, look, you could theoretically be playing World of Warcraft nonstop and you're just kind of like in a quote unquote bubble. But usually philosophical discussions don't have the same dopamine eternity that can a video game. Like, we have to go take the kids, to town in a little bit, right? There's a kind of natural cutoff point, and right, I could be a simulation. Who knows? So it's very interesting. I do wonder if disembodiment is a code word for bubble that we associate modern academia with. And since we're so used to and trained to associate doing philosophy with being on a college campus, therefore disconnected, we have a new associational logic where we're on the lookout to see that happening wherever there's any kind of philosophical rhetoric. And so we go, oh, well, we know they're not in a bubble because they're not on a campus, but they're disembodied. So that's a new kind of leap that's occurring that, of course, has some wisdom to it, but we can also take it way, way, way too far, I think. The other thing I'll say, and then I'll give it back to you, is that it's almost like today we're also seeing a kind of, dare I say, market competition between expensive philosophy, cheap philosophy, and free philosophy. Free philosophy would almost be, I guess, meeting with people at a bookstore, in town at the library. It literally could be free. Then you have expensive on college, and the cheap would be like using Zoom or different things like that. And I'm trying to fit in free here because it would go back to the Greeks or whatever. And really, it's a kind of like competition, really, where the people who went through the college academic are looking over at the free stuff and like, well, that's interesting. The free people are looking over there saying, okay, there's a kind of competition that's going on that in that competition, following market forces, you tend to get innovations or new emergences of philosophy, which I'm using as a catchword here for just intellectualism in general, but perhaps philosophy in particular, because it's so able to be about anything. There's a certain like a kind of quality of philosophy that is emerging in the competition, if you will, or the dialectic between the cheap philosophy and the expensive philosophy, that's trying to find this middle ground between, because like we said at the beginning, there's some middle ground between rigor, where you're being a rigorous reader, but then at the same time applying to something outside of philosophers being rigorous with other philosophers, which gives you modern academia. Because like you said, there's this thing where we've basically ignored the addresses of postmodernity. Well, that's a sign of a lack of rigor of some kind. But then there's also this ditch of everyone being a kind of police for the right interpretation of Derrida or the right interpretation of Hegel that doesn't seem to be correct because it leads to a certain bogging down, or it's like walking on eggshells. It kills the discussion. So there seems to be a need for a kind of rigor is emerging out of the dialectic between the cheap philosophy and the expensive philosophy that's trying to navigate this road between rigor for rigor's sake, but also speaking to the concrete without straw manning everyone like the postmodernists. This is where my mind goes. But let me give it to you, Javier Rivera.
Yeah, I think this is the exact problem. I mean, actually, Buber does talk about this a little bit, like how we've divided our lives into spheres, which I would call bubbles, right? Like there's my work bubble, there's my relaxation bubble after work, and then there's like my personal bubble, right? And we like to keep all of these in general relatively separate. Which may actually, which may arguably show how, I'm going to use this word, disembubbled we are, maybe like, how actual, how much bubbling is going on to where we no longer have any communication between our, the bubbles that are kind of within our lives, right? So in some ways it's, I guess if I'm being charitable to Hegel here, the fact that we didn't choose to communicate to each bubble really shows how disembodied we are, right? And I think that's some of the issues, because even the algorithms within mediums kind of already control a sort of atmosphere of the bubble, right? It sort of gives a kind of ambience to the bubble itself. But ironically, there's so much intersectionality between mediums that people not only post on Instagram, they also post on Facebook, they also post on TikTok, they also post on YouTube. So it's like there's so much intersectionality between mediums that it's like good. It's communicating. You're communicating a message through multiple mediums, so you're intersecting bubbles. But it does seem that it still falls under a bigger bubble, meaning like this is just my personal intellectual bubble. This is just my hobby bubble or something like that. And as much as that's nice, we don't have any real interaction with the other areas of thought or experiences of life that we just, I guess, not interested or don't or want to maintain them as separate. Like, it's such a funny example that I have about how I work in urgent care, and it's a mixture between analog paper like consent forms and then like technological tablet like sign here with your finger, right? And I can always tell the people that don't have like computers or like internet, they really like struggle like comprehending like, you want me to do what? Like sign with my finger, right? And it's weird because maybe from their point of view, we're so disembodied that like technology has taken over our lives. But then from my perspective, they're so disembodied because they don't even know how to function within the already arriving emergence, right, of what is here. So there is like this kind of like weird reflection of like, you're disembodied yet embodied, but I'm also disembodied yet embodied because I don't see how this affects you and you don't see how this affects me. And if I believe that I'm absolutely correct in my own bubble versus yours, then I'm perhaps more disembodied than ever. um, but yeah, I think, you know, some of the things that have really helped me in like my own life is the fact that I always try to get philosophy to talk, or I make my separate spheres of life talk to each other, you know. And I think that's a very difficult skill to cultivate, but it's worth cultivating because obviously I can't talk to my girlfriend and just say and echo the terms of Hegel and be like, so this is what sublation is. It's like, no, you might have to go about it in a sort of analogical way or a metaphor kind of way, and then be like, so this is what he means by dialectics, even though that's just a fancy term, but it sort of captures what we're trying to portray here. And so that ironically roots me from not just being like a abstract Hegelian reader, but it roots me back to more concrete because I'm making another sphere of my life talk to each other by trying to communicate it to my girlfriend who actually has never read Hegel or never read philosophy. So the approach must be different. The approach transforms itself the moment that we make each other talk. And so I guess, I mean, maybe Buber is right? Like there's actually not a lot of dialogues going on. Like it's just a bunch of like monological talking, right? Monological writing and experiences rather than real dialogue, which is not just conversations, but like a real attempt to see the other side. And I think if we're going to give, I guess, if we're going to give any substance to like what may a concrete or being here actually means is actually understanding or attempting to understand the other side, right? While understanding yours as well. I think I'll leave it there.
Excellent. I think, a few things come to mind. First off, on this idea of being correct equaling disembodied, I think there's a heck of a lot of truth to that. I always like what Maurice Blondel pointed out in Action, where he said it's very funny that we think the point of thinking is gaining certainty or gaining correctness, because as soon as you're certain about something, you stop caring about it. Like once you know that doorknob works, you don't think about that doorknob anymore. Like as soon as you're like done with something, you're done with it. And so the funny thing is, what he's pointing out is that if thinking is about correctness or certainty, thinking is about destroying itself. And that also basically means that you're disembodied. You're disembodied because your brain's dead. That's a way you actually disembody yourself. You don't have a body anymore because your brain doesn't work. It works both ways. You can disbody yourself by taking your brain on a stick outside your body, but you can also disembody yourself by destroying your brain. And what Blondel is basically saying is that the goal of philosophy and correctness and certainty leads to a kind of death of thought. And you do get disembodied if your brain dies, right? We don't think about that, but it does. And that's why his whole thing, and I would say the main thrust of like frickin' the modern counter Enlightenment thinkers is tactile knowledge, action, encounters, all of this kind of language of it's not utilitarianism, it's not pragmaticism, it's more on the side of a phenomenology that is the surprise. Whoa, didn't see that coming. Can I think it? Can I act in accordance with the surprise? So it's more of a philosophy of the surprise, which then is almost a skill, martial arts, thinking, active. It's an entirely different kind of metaphoric structure for it. And so I think that's very good on what you're getting at. And I feel like what we see now between the cheap philosophy and the expensive philosophy, if you give me that language, is it's almost like a dialectic now is forming between rigor in thought and thought in action. Because it's like, okay, we want to be rigorous in our thought, but we don't want to be spending so much time being rigorous in our thought that we're not acting in the world. And likewise, we don't want to be acting in a world that's thoughtless. So there's some kind of tension between rigor in thought and thought in action that has to be maintained, that has to be thought out. Also, I very much think that, I was also going to say that maybe one of the reasons university people don't put different spheres in conversation is because they don't have different spheres. They live on the campus. It's all like under the same umbrella. That's one of the advantages now of the free philosophy, of the cheap philosophy, is you do actually have different spheres to put in conversation. Because the other problem is most college professors are married to who? someone who also went to college, and they probably live on the college, and they probably live in the town around the college. And so they don't actually have a lot of spheres. And also their working life is about the thinking. And so it's very difficult in the expensive college model to actually even have different spheres. The logistical reality of it favors a bubble, even if you don't want it to be. Even if you as a college person like, well, I don't want to be in a bubble. Just the logistical structure of what makes expensive philosophy possible lends itself in the direction of not having a lot of spheres. So you don't have to, you just simply do not run into the problem of explaining Hegel to someone who hasn't read Hegel or doesn't even understand it, or different things, right? It's just not something that emerges in your life regularly to become an essential feature of your thinking. And so it's like this kind of even ability to connect spheres or think across spheres, which are not merely here's the key. Yeah, you have academics who say, oh, we have to think across disciplines. There's actually a difference between disciplines and spheres, right? Like disciplines is like, oh, we need to think philosophy, economics, and sociology. Well, funny enough, colleges don't even do that. But if you do that, that's not actually necessarily the same as different spheres, because spheres are like thinking, girlfriend, work, side of the road, hardware store. So there even is, now don't get me wrong, there's something closer to different spheres when you do different fields, but like spheres and disciplines are actually radical. There's like another level of connecting across spheres and disciplines. And the last thing, and then I'll give it back to you. And alas, I'll have to go in about 15 minutes, but it's always a pleasure to see you, Javier Rivera. The last thing I'll say is, for me, it was always extremely important to be able to explain a philosopher to someone who had never read the philosopher, who was sincere. Like they sincerely wanted to understand. Like they asked you and they wanted to understand. Well, if that's your test, most college professors, they need to be able to understand it to who? Students who did the reading. Oh, well, I can use the lingo. Oh, I can talk. Oh, you're all philosophy students. But if you're talking to a guy in the big T who wants to understand, you're going to use metaphor. You're going to use imagery. All the things in philosophy class they say not to use. Well, you know why they say not to use it? Because they don't have to work across spheres. Metaphors, simple language. Like, now, you can't make Hegel simple, but you can make the speaking of Hegel simpler. There are also parts of Hegel that are easier to get than other parts, right? And so when you talk to someone across spheres, engage in tactics, if you will, not in a kind of like manipulation, but strategies, but imagery. You're thinking about how you're speaking. That's really good. That increases the likelihood you're more more concrete, more lived, more human. But if you never have to engage in that practice, that's going to contribute to the Humean bad philosophy that tends to not be across spheres. And that's actually maybe a good language. Like all these counter-enlightenment thinkers, they basically want that philosophy becomes bad when there's no across-sphereness. Like that's what tends to lead to the trouble. And you can see that being pointed out in postmodernity. Basically, they're like, hey, we got to make sure we incorporate methodologies that are making space for the other all the way down. All the way down. And that seems to be part of the equation here. But let me give it back to you, Javier Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's like, it's something that I struggle with, trying to communicate. Because like, lay people will say like, can you just make the language simpler for me to understand, right? And of course, it always comes with a risk, because then you like risk reducing a very and making like a very bad caricature of Hegel, right? Sort of reducing the complexity. But sometimes I think just to get across the sort of big, like the main picture of what is being said, maybe that is what is necessary. But then also like I always caveated with this is an issue of translation, right? Like it's never going to be a direct correspondence to like the way actually Hegel is. So it's like we have like two sides of infinity here, right? Like the way that I understand Hegel, which always demands more reading of Hegel, and more encountering more sophisticated interpretations of Hegel. Meanwhile, the other side of the infinity is like, how can I give a better simplistic answer or understanding so this person can understand Hegel without necessarily being driven to read them, because being driven to read them gives a certain privilege of thought that they may not necessarily have or be nor interested in. Of course, we could risk that they could be interested in, but we can never guarantee that they will be interested enough to actually pursue the work itself. So in some sense, we are tasked with juggling kind of like a double infinity on each side, right? Like I have to constantly enrich my understanding, sophisticated understanding through the academic circles, whether it be like formal structure academia or like, cheap philosophy, through conversations. And then the other side of like just talking to laymen and people that don't read philosophy. How do you then grapple with that task? How do you, what are the avenues for that? And, something that helps for me communicate within like my own context is like, I try to begin with something very simple and then like maybe build up on it. Like, like, okay, so you believe in certainty. Like, okay, like, what is this thing? Or, or like, I like the mirror metaphor, like you're certain you're yourself, right? And yet, ironically, if you take the metaphor of the mirror, you can never fully see yourself, right? So if we accept that metaphor from the beginning, that we can never fully see ourselves, just the way we look at the world, there's a sort of reflection of that happening. We can never fully see the world because ironically, we can never fully see ourselves. And so, I build up from there and then I make whatever argument or whatever statement that Hegel wants to make, right? Why is that? Why does that exist, right? This is the problem that Hegel's trying to encounter, right? Because there seems to be a contradiction. Like, I feel like I understand myself and yet I can't see myself. How do I navigate that purpose? And so it frames the question. I think I think as I approach this task more often with my partner, it seems to be more like, showing that it's like a matter of like, how do we frame the question and then relay what is being said, and make the question more simple, but then also relay it in a metaphorical way, rather than using the sort of verbose terminology that is always inherent in reading philosophy. And sometimes we even trap ourselves, right? We use like verbose philosophy, like verbose vocabulary, and we may not even have the same understanding of it, right? We've all read it, but like we're not even questioning each other. Like, well, I'm sorry, how exactly are you understanding sublation? But yeah, I do have to go too, but I'll let you give your input after.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much, and I think you're pointing at figuring out the difference between trying to memorize Hegel, like this kind of perfect reading, and rigor of Hegel. Because you can be rigorous in your reading of Hegel, but not be striving to perfectly memorize Hegel. And that seems to be a space that has not been thought because you haven't had the condition of cheap philosophy to think it. There just hasn't been the imperative to think it. There hasn't been the reason to think it. And so we're in a different socioeconomic situation that invites new ways of doing things that perhaps can take on problems that have not had to be thought before. I mean, you should strive to be as clear as possible. Now, that's not self-evident what that is. It is not easy to know what that is. But you should strive to make it clear. Because clear is a kind of test. If the ideas you have really matter, then the ability to make them clear will clarify their importance. So there's a test there. And if they are something that other people can grasp, it would suggest that they want to grasp, so they also agree that these ideas matter. So clarity, metaphor, things like that. Like instead of talking, and also too, generally, the great creative writer does not tell you the bookshelf was large. They tried to describe the bookshelf as having boards that almost reached the ceiling. The front door was made of glass with 2 handles. They described the whole thing. So don't talk about Hegel's dialectic. Talk about how a value like freedom if you overextend it, turns into its opposite. If everyone was free all the time, it's anarchism, and now it feels like oppression, right? So you don't, in the same way that the good creative writer doesn't just tell you the bookshelf was tall, they describe it in a manner that makes you imagine it, see it, and experience it. Likewise, the philosophers should describe the idea in a manner that makes the penny drop, that makes it click, that makes the person grasp it. And so I think someone like the great Robert Olson Butler, who I think is just like wrote the greatest book on basically writing stories out there, From Where Dreams Come, is something that all philosophers should take seriously. But with that, I will run. Mr. Javier Rivera, it's a pleasure. Michelle, always a pleasure. And we will go. Mr. Rivera, thank you for your time, sir.
Yeah,
All the
thank you,
best.
guys.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.